Hey, how's it going, everyone? I'm Dylan. I work on the product team at AerOps, and yeah, excited to walk you through how the title says how AerOps chases friction with building AI products with Claude. And I guess the main, really big takeaway I want you guys to come away with is building agents and just making agents accessible is honestly a really hard problem. I guess like with developers, it's a bit easier. People are used to kind of all these different concepts. But when you try to make these accessible to personas like marketers, there are a lot of friction points. And I'm going to talk through some of the friction points that we have seen and battled with. So just to start off, quick intro of who we are at AerOps. We are a growth marketing platform for AI search. And AI search for you guys is kind of like SEO, but for engines like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. Buyers are asking on Claude different questions of, hey, I want to buy like these pair of sunglasses. How do you know, and how are you making sure that you are showing up for these searches? So we help brands see how they're appearing in search, identify gaps, take action on those gaps, whether that be creating content, refreshing content, and then being able to measure the impact of whether or not the actions that they're taking actually worked. And so, quick agenda. I'm just going to walk through real quickly how we got here, kind of our approach for agents, a quick just run through of what we just launched last week with AirOps Next, and then 2 friction points that we really focused and dialed in on for our launch when it comes to making and giving people the power of Claude and making that super accessible. And then closing with a couple of other friction points that we're really looking at for our next, kind of next act. So how we got here. AirOps used to be, or still is, but we were mainly focused on orchestrating content through a traditional workflow builder. So node-based style, kind of like an NAN, where you can drag and drop these different nodes. You can orchestrate different variables and how things flow through this elaborate workflow. And with a workflow builder style, and especially with our core customer and audience being marketers, you would hit this complexity ceiling where you're trying to teach a content marketer what liquid text is, what JSON is, and all these different concepts. And they also had this short shelf life, which as new models came out, Claude would release, Opus 4.6, 4.7, it keeps on going. You would have to update these different steps. It changes the way that you're building this workflow. So customers are constantly having to go and update this workflow they just spent so much time in building. And also just if they update a step in like step 1, they don't realize that variables and outputs are referenced in step 20. So there's a bunch of the complexity, and it was really brittle. And scaling enterprise use cases obviously then required someone technical to help really guide through this workflow creating process. So our goal was to really lower this barrier to entry for content marketers to build and ship their ideas and the way they want to create content. And also while still maintaining that quality bar, which is a very big focus for them because, of course, brands don't want to just be pumping AI slop out and having governance around keeping those enterprise standards. So this is a quick just preview of, or not preview, but a look at what our workflow studio looked like. This use case was actually to create a content brief with internal links. So as you can see, it gets kind of gnarly in there. Just for something that does seem pretty simple. It just goes to show like how much thought goes into a lot of these workflows and the way that they want to create and orchestrate content. So how can we take this kind of structure and create an agent experience while still harnessing the way that we use Claude Code and these other agent tools? So I think the first really breaking point when we decided to invest heavier into agents was really with the release of Opus 4.5. I think that's when a lot of people started to see really how smart the models were in tool calling, being able to follow instructions in a way that they weren't breaking the standards that they were setting for it. And for us, we at the same time we were trying to make building easier. And one of the ways that we do that, and I'll dive more into it a bit later, is through kind of this document-based style builder. And the first thing that we tried doing was actually taking this kind of like Google Doc in a way and with an LLM compiling a workflow in the background, which was an interesting idea. It was like a bit brittle. Like there's a lot of error points that can happen there, trying to turn like this non-deterministic kind of instructions and making this actual workflow. Then one after that was then using a traditional agent orchestration framework where you're kind of defining these nodes, you're letting an LLM decide different decision points, and we got to a point where we were getting pretty good outputs, but with those traditional frameworks, they honestly are like pretty brittle. If I ever want to change the way I want to orchestrate different sub-agents, I basically have to make code changes, right? Like I actually have to go and change the way I'm routing these different nodes and steps together. And that's when we really decided to invest heavier into the Claude Agent SDK, where it's honestly pretty awesome that you can kind of orchestrate agents just through Markdown files and provide skills in different contexts, really just by manipulating this environment and harness rather than actually like doing that programmatically through a traditional agent framework. So that's what kind of led to our launch, which we just had last week with AirOps Next. And briefly, just to run through what did we exactly launch. The first one was Quill, which was kind of our branding of our agent captain for content marketers. Quill had access to all the data that we provide to teams, whether that be AI search data, the brand context and brand kit, which houses like literally everything about a brand. So Quill is following the instructions of how content should be created, and just making it easier throughout the UI to get people from insights they see in the dashboards to actual actions, being able to take the findings and gaps and get to that very next step. The next one is Playbooks. So Playbooks is basically our new building experience. And for all you like developers out there, it's pretty much like a skill. That's very much like what we grounded it in, is like how can we make skills accessible? And marketers are all like used to like kind of a document-based style. But we just allowed for like collaboration on these playbooks / skills, and also governance and versioning. So you'll have people with 10 different versions of this playbook of how do I want to create this piece of content. And just real quick, just results that we've seen from customers. We did case study with Parallel. We helped them produce and create content, and they saw 130% increase in citation rate, 42% increase in share of voice, and they were able to go live in 1 week, which for us is a huge accomplishment, just because traditionally, especially because we work with these enterprise customers, it usually takes around a month, at least with like the workflow builder, of constant feedback, going back and forth, like, hey, this is not really how I want to be speaking in my blog. There's citations that are like kind of being hallucinated or aren't right. They're not. These are other citations that I want to use for this piece of content. So it was really incredible to be able to get to that acceptance criteria in such a short amount of time. And other just like quick customer quotes too. Incredible to see how agents has moved what really like LLMs can do, and how marketers are viewing using these more agentic workflows. Animals saying it felt more like a mid-level strategist for their team, and at Rippling being able to focus on offboarding a lot of the tedious tasks and really focusing on like where does my expertise come in, and being able to add that value to the agent while it's creating that content and feeding that unique context. So we were able to really accomplish this by focusing on 2 main friction points. So when building and trying to bring high quality agents to these more highly professional and enterprise use cases, we really had to focus on how do we fit into the actual workflow of these content marketers, and how do we make sure that we ensure quality outputs through the way that we're building our harness and orchestrating our harness. So the first one, friction point I want to talk through is, I have it saying like endless use cases forces intentionality. And I think a lot of us have probably been there too when we first started using Claude Code or using an agent, and we're like, this thing is like really powerful. Like I can do a ton of different things. You're like, it's really easy to start sprawling into this spiral of, just like there's so many different use cases. And I think not only on like the product engineering side, but also for customers, how do we be very intentional about what is the actual like problem that we're trying to solve here, and how do we really force it and understand like what is this workflow that we're trying to solve for people. So Kind of like in my head now, I have this like mini like Steve Ballmer head just going like marketers, marketers, marketers. Just like really trying to focus on who is like my customer in this use case that I want to tackle. And just a quick glimpse into what does like this workflow look like for content marketers. This is one example use case for content creation where they'll discover what do they want to create on. They'll research of this specific topic that they want to make sure that they're ranking in AI search or traditional search for. They'll draft a brief, generate the article, and then add any sort of like internal linking and best practices when it comes to SEO and AEO. And throughout this whole process, there are different human review points. Human review comes up a ton, and human in the loop comes up a ton in content marketing, especially just with when you're being cognizant about the content that you're pushing out. You really want to make sure that it is adhering to the way that your brand talks, to the information that you're serving out on the internet, and just giving you the best shot of also being surfaced within kind of like generative AI search. So that whole process kind of led us to focus on two parts when it comes to the most, I guess these are kind of like the two most important parts we saw with the content marketing flow. One is having a document-based kind of like IDE, which again was like our playbook view. We wanted, marketers are super familiar with documents. They are used to Google Docs. They've probably been working with docs for years and ages, even before like technology. Like you have this piece of paper that you're kind of defining how you want to do something. So making that familiar versus this node-based workflow builder. Transparency was also really important. One thing that users actually really liked about the workflow builder was that they could actually see what tools were being used at each step. So how do you still have a document, but at the same time, when I read through, I can understand like this is the exact tool that I'm using at this instant. This is the type of context I'm feeding at this point, and just being transparent around that. And that kind of goes hand in hand with control as well. How can I make sure that I'm still in control of this set of instructions or workflow that I'm building, especially now that it is really like not as like deterministic because it is like a document. So those are three areas that we focused on. And then again, on enforcing human review. How can we bring governance, configurability, accountability into an agentic workflow, which I think is pretty unique for us. And I don't think a lot of brands like kind of like tackle like that problem. I think a lot of it is like with agents, also with coding, is you kind of let it go. It'll finish what it's done with. And human review in that instance with coding is usually like with PR reviews after it's literally finished with the whole job. It's rarely ever like while it's going through the actual coding process, it'll kind of like ask for feedback of taste in different areas. So that was like another area that we really focused on. And with that, I actually want to jump into a quick just like demo of what this looks like within AerOps. So yeah, the first thing I want to cover is our playbook. And again, it's kind of like this skill, this natural language builder where I can go in and either like type in like with a slash command and define different inputs, different outputs, and also all these different tools that content marketers can use and that they're super used to using. And with it, when it comes to tools as well, you can add any MCP. So if there's other outside connectors that you usually use, you can use those and access them. We also have the ability to schedule different triggers. So this gives this kind of like always on skill or playbook or agent that can do this certain action at either a scheduled cadence based off webhooks. We also have Monitor, which we've kind of like partnered with like Parallel when it comes to just being able to put a query. And I like saying, watch the internet in a way. So when certain things happen, it would trigger off this playbook to then run. And then the last one is AEO Insights. So whenever a metric drops, let's say like my citation rate dropped in the last week, then it would trigger off one of these playbooks. It can go and like do this research and come back to me of, hey, like this is the reason why this happened. And as I jump through into this kind of process of someone basically create this SOP of how they want to create this blog, if I come to the outline section, we enforce human review by adding the ability to assign different users at the end of each section. So as the agent goes through this whole playbook, it'll come to this section step, and decide to, I think we have a tool in the background that will then like fire off. And basically, since I'm assigned, I'm the only person that can actually unblock this agent. Other people can still leave like comments on the outputs and artifacts and different feedback, but I'm kind of like this gatekeeper now that has to review this piece of content, and we do that to ensure like that governance. And what that actually looks like and how that's surfaced to users, one way is through our inbox. So we have an inbox within AerOps where every single time human review happens or different opportunities are surfaced, users can actually come in here and see those directly. So I can click on one of these items. It will open up our basically like agent run. So on the right side is basically this agent like running through its whole process. I can kind of see its thought traces. On the left side, all the different outputs and artifacts that are one defined by me through that playbook, and I can then either edit this existing document, leave certain comments, and then kind of kick it off and approve it. The other way that we also surface this governance in human review is through our grid. So our grid is our way of orchestrating content, or orchestrating basically content at scale. So in this specific example, I'm just kind of showing like the way that you can actually collaborate with these. So Augustine is also in this document with me. I'm able to edit it, also leave human review. If I close this out, I can see within the grid all these different kind of outputs that are running. We're basically kind of like running skills at scale, where each one of these rows is a specific job that I want to accomplish, and I'm running that playbook. And I can also then see like human review at scale and click in these different cells to then leave like my feedback and ensure that all this content's talking in my right tone of voice. Awesome. The second friction point I want to talk about was with agents. The biggest worry is around consistency, especially when you're coming from this workflow base. So how did we tackle going about producing quality outputs? How do we make sure that customers are also seeing that and being aligned to that as well? One of the ways that we visualize, and actually like this graphic here was created and used and referenced by our VP of sales, which like funny enough is actually like one of the best explanations I feel like I've seen of harness engineering. On the product side, we've tried a couple of times, but it's just funny, like from the go-to-market side was the best way that we've been able to explain this, where you kind of have this car where you then have an engine, the model obviously being Claude, Opus, or Sonnet, whatever engine that you want to pick for that, and everything else that goes around that and everything else that you build on top of it is super important in terms of creating a super great agent. So the two that I want to focus on, and the one that we focused on the most, was around tools and the way that we're orchestrating context. And the Claude Agent SDK and also Claude Managed Agents API have been super helpful in terms of being able to iterate on this quickly, and just making sure that we're like kind of like programmatically setting these different sub agents. And yeah, they've been like super instrumental in terms of us getting to a quality output. So the first one I want to cover is around tools, and basically the background on tools are, you could give an agent a bunch of primitive tools. So in this specific example, what we were always trying to accomplish with Claude and our agent was helping Claude understand what is wrong with a page on my website. We have different tools like access to traffic data, citation data, scrapers, so I can find like similar competitor pages. And we started off like honestly with a skill of hey, here's the way of dissecting whether or not a page is losing, what's wrong with a specific page, are like the schemas off, how's it compared to competitor pages, and it would kind of go on like these like safari trips, and it's honestly like a bit like token inefficient. So one thing that we want to focus on is how can we create specialized tools of jobs that Claude does that we know is going to do like over and over again, and how can we just make that a bit more deterministic, where Claude can then put a URL and immediately spit out everything about that page, as well as different structured content gaps versus like other similar pages in that space, as well as what should be my target keywords and my target prompts for it. The second tool that we made in just like workflow that we saw that was super common with content marketers was our page versus tool, which was essentially being able to benchmark my page against top ranking pages in that space, and finding what exactly is behind those pages and how can I close those gaps. So this is just like a really simple way of getting context efficiently. It's kind of like a code mode in a way. I know that's been something that's been popular nowadays, is being able to be more programmatic in terms of how we're fetching context versus kind of like looping through these different tool calls. It's like, can I actually just like produce code that will fetch exactly what I need in one loop? The second one is through subagents. Subagents have definitely been instrumental and crucial in terms of getting to that quality of output. In general, like what we tell users too with Playbooks, and honestly when you're first creating your agent harness, is to actually just start off with Claude itself and just have it go through its own tool calls, and really not trying to make it too complex and all the context that you're trying to give to it. So that's where we start off with. And we were reaching a couple of kind of like air spots when it came to the quality of the outputs we're getting. So what we did was decide to add on, like over time, certain subagents. The first one was a compliance check. So being able to just make sure that we're not like kind of polluting that main context window, just because context raw honestly is like still a huge problem and will probably continue to be a problem when it comes to like what are the tokens and text that you're attending to. So being able to spin off the subagent that will go through and have everything that it needs to know about my brand and whether or not the content that I just produced is following those rules. It'll come back with a score, whether or not it adhered to them, what were the things wrong with it, and then the agent can then take that feedback and then kind of make edits. The second one we did was around writing. We first, again, like tried just using like the regular Claude harness to actually write the content, but we found that it was better to spin off a subagent with its own very focused context window to focus solely on just writing that piece of content. So it's not distracted by any of the research that was created or any of maybe like old compliance checks, and just being able to like very focus in on that one job. The next one is a brand kit subagent. So again, like brand kit for us is basically just like kind of like a knowledge base or context layer of everything you need to know about a brand. And this is something that we kick off actually at the beginning of all of our runs, where we have a brand kit subagent that will go and fetch all of the relevant context it needs and then stores it as like an internal artifact. So then throughout the whole process, our main agent loop can then reference those artifacts versus having to like use tools in our MCP to refetch like that context. Because then what happens is in different subagents, you might actually have different brand context that was fetched over time. So just being able to fetch that up front, store as an artifact, and then just redirect the agent to always be referencing that same artifact. And then finally, just still being able to add custom ones. This is more for us like an internal tool where like some of our like solutions architect who work for our customers can spin off different subagents when needed, and just really helps with just maintaining that context. I think that's definitely been the biggest learning, is although like context windows do continue to grow, you have like 1 million context window with Opus 4.7, but just still being really cognizant that just because it is larger doesn't mean that you should be like using the whole thing. You should still be very efficient of what sorts of contexts are you're letting the model attend to. Yeah, and in terms of results, what we saw was actually a 8% decrease in like fewer tokens consumptions around at least that specific tool. So instead of, again, like that tool spinning off different primitives and going over and over again, you actually just have this one tool call that fetches a page and then all the results from it. The second one from that, also like those specialized tools, was also speed. Beforehand, while it was making like those 20 different tool calls to fetch all the context it needs, you just have this one entry point that spits out everything that you need. And then when it comes to the quality side, we had 10 enterprise customers while we were running this beta actually start publishing content in under 2 weeks. So they were able to self-serve and also get to a quality of output through these agents, which was something that used to be kind of like a hold-handing experience. It was also had like a really high kind of like ceiling. So yeah, when it comes to like building these agents and with Claude being able to execute and making it easier to execute on things, It's really easy to think that there are no more problems to solve, but really every single time a problem is solved, just that friction point always keeps moving. So those were kind of the two that we were really chasing after and we really want to tackle. And there's a ton more that we also want to continue chasing. But I think just overall, it's a great thing to just continue to chase friction, because that really is how you create production agents and make those more accessible to users outside of more technical spaces. So just to quickly close out, the next two kind of friction points that we're looking to battle and excited to share more learnings on are around really self-improvement and feedback loops, which there were awesome talks yesterday around dreaming sequences and how I think the most interesting one is actually how do you structure summaries of different traces. What's the best way of collecting the most relevant memories, and also like forgetting is actually a feature, like being able to forget certain types of memories. And the last one is benchmarking content creation agents. I think something really interesting about our space is that it isn't law, it isn't coding, it's not something that is really easy to say whether or not it's something's correct. There is a lot of taste that goes into a piece of content that you create, and there's a lot of opinions of how I want certain context to be formatted and created. So what are like the best ways that we are creating benchmarks so that every single time we do change our harness, we add a sub agent or we decide to add a skill to our harness, how do we know that it's actually improving outputs and not just kind of vibes that we're going after? But yeah, I'm around all day. Would love to chat with you guys and hear about what you guys are building. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. Thank you.